Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the third day of the WHO Global Evidence to Policy Summit. It's a delight to see you all back again for the very last day of our event. We had two very interesting days behind us with excellent keynote speakers on day one, our chief scientist, Patrick Valens, Salim Abdul Karim, and the Honorable Minister of Health of Chile on day one. And then some very interesting panel discussions yesterday, first of all on cross-evidence ecosystem collaboration and also on citizens engagement yesterday with very interactive plenary discussions and engagement Padlets as well. Today, we have two additional very interesting sessions coming up. The first one is looking at institutionalization of evidence-informed decision-making. We have our office in the Eastern Mediterranean who will be leading this institutionalization panel. And I would like to, without further ado, hand over to my colleagues in the Eastern Mediterranean. So Arash and Mernaz, over to you, please.
Thank you, Tanya. And this is a pleasure to be with you and with, as Tanya mentioned, opening the third day of this important summit, the second global summit for evidence to policy that WHO has hosted in the last 3 years. So with my co-host, Dr. Mehnaz Khairandis, we are honored to host a very esteemed panel of speakers today. So, and the focus of the discussion, as Tanya referred to, is on institutionalization of evidence-informed policymaking. And then we hope, within the very short time that we have together, but with esteemed panelists, to cover important tools and consideration and also contextual factors, including the ecosystem in a country that affect evidence-informed policymaking. We try to answer 3 key questions in a very brief way. What are the current approaches to facilitate evidence-informed policymaking institutionalization at national level? What can we learn from experiences, positive or less so positive, depending on the context, the things that have been tried that have worked well, or the things that have been difficult to implement, and also see how the general government approaches to policymaking affects evidence-informed policymaking and its institutionalization in health area. So these are the focus. In terms of the structure of the panel, so as I mentioned, we have 5 speakers. They will talk about different aspects from different angles of the work. The first 4 speakers each have only 5 minutes, and that's to make sure we have time for discussion. And the last speaker will have 7 minutes, so that's how we go forward. And then after we listen to all 5 speakers, we open to discussion. And discussion will be based on the questions that colleagues are sharing in the chat. You will be on the dear participants from around the world are putting in the chat. My colleagues will be looking at those, trying to identify the key questions, and then we try to address few of those, and then obviously the rest through the process. So I don't want to take more time with this. So I have the honor and the pleasure to invite the first speaker. So Dr. Peter Gluckman, President of the International Science Council in France, and he's going to talk about how the sort of institutional structure is defined and affected by the functions and the objectives of the institution and the setting in the country. Peter, you have 5 minutes. Over to you.
I was Chief Science Advisor to the Government of New Zealand for 10 years, so I'm going to use that as the background for my comments. We always need a complex ecosystem of academies, universities, think tanks, as well as whatever the formal processes of science advice. But you can't design that without thinking about the functions of science advice, because the components of the ecosystem one needs depend on the function. And there are really 5 major functions of science advice: to help a policymaker understand a system, to help them plan how to affect the system, and that depends where you are within the policy cycle, to evaluate an intervention, or to undertake foresight, or to manage a crisis. And all of those require different structures and different equipment. And also the target varies. It can be the policymaker, it can be the legislator, it can be the cabinet of a government, or it can be the prime minister or president. And again, structures matter. In terms of the two major components of science advice, they may not exist within the same structure. That is, firstly, the collection and synthesis of the evidence in a pluralistic way that's needed to provide advice, and secondly, the transmission of that advice to the policymaker, which I call brokerage. Evidence synthesis is often done in universities, academies, committees, and so forth. The issue of the interface, however, between science, the science system, and the policy community is actually a matter of skilled brokerage. And there are important skills associated with brokerage. The ability to explain what we know, what we don't know, the limits on our knowledge, the uncertainties, and the caveats that arise, and therefore the options that emerge. And people need to have the skills to do that if they're placed at that interface. There's also two other matters that matter. Is this a matter of formal advice by way of reports, or is it a matter of informal advice by way of discussion, which may occur early in the policy cycle, or may be at the end of a policy cycle, and is obviously what generally happens in emergencies? Again, how that happens and where it happens is affected, determines whether this is best done by committee or best done by an individual. At the end of the day, in the decade I worked as Chief Science Advisor for the Prime Ministers of New Zealand, it was clear to me that often it was informal discussion between me and the decision-making Prime Minister that was the most effective form of ensuring that evidence was embedded within the policy making. On the other hand, when working with the technical ministries, it was committees that were important. And the most important thing was what checks and balances you have to ensure pluralistic input. Finally, and I think within the lessons we learned from COVID, it's quite clear that one needs to be pre-prepared. What we saw in COVID lots of times was competition, egotistical competition between scientists to compete to give for access to power. That's inappropriate. What you need is an informed, properly defined mechanism of access with the appropriately trained people within it. And therefore, the most important system that I think that matters is something like the New Zealand system or the UK system, which has both a chief science advisor and departmental science advisors who are well equipped to reach out to the national academic community, the national scientific community, and academies. Science advisors do not know everything. They are there because they're skilled at interpreting between the policy community and the scientific community in both directions. And so much of what a science advisor is actually doing is ensuring that the right question is asked by the policymaker and the right people are provided to answer it. And that, again, means that the policymaker, that the science advisor must have particular diplomatic skills to do that. In countries which do not have individual science advisors and rely on committees, as do much of the European systems, I don't believe you get the level of intimate effect on the policy process, the trusted import that you can have, and committees do not work well in emergencies. I'll finish there.
Okay, many thanks, Peter. You highlighted several key points. Among those, I would like to refer to two of them, differentiating between the formal and informal processes for science advice, and also the role that scientists may play may sometimes hamper the evidence-informed decision-making processes. So with that, I'm delighted to invite the second speaker of the day, this panel, Professor Justin Parkhurst, Associate Professor of Global Health Policy at the London School of Economics and Political Sciences. Justin is going to talk about the normative and governance consideration that could be or should be considered for institutionalization of evidence-informed policymaking. Justin, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. And I had some slides. Are they being shared? Great. Okay. Excellent. Thank you. So I'll try and be as brief as I can. And I think it's nice to follow on from Peter. Maybe I'll push people a little bit to think outside what we've been talking about so far and argue that I feel we might even add another function, if I can follow on from Peter there. Another function of policy advice systems, I would argue, can be and perhaps should be to improve democratic governance and good governance. So what do I mean by that? Well, in brief, what I would argue is that science for policy is based on an assumption that that science is in service of the public good and in service of public interests. But to know what the appropriate and correct science is from a scientific perspective, there has to be an explicit process by which the public interest is identified and transparently elucidated by our leaders. So in short, we need clarification of the goals that policymakers are pursuing if on the public's benefit, on the public's behalf, if we want to know what is the right science for policy. And by clarifying those goals, we can better hold policymakers to account. Next slide, please. So recently in some of my work, I proposed what I called a good governance of evidence framework. This, again, is an attempt to highlight and make more explicit the normative concepts that might guide us in building these evidence advisory systems, the institutionalization of systems that shape how evidence is used, as others have talked about, Tanya and others yesterday and the day before. Systems that are institutionalized, in fact, govern our use of evidence. So we need to start asking questions about what does it mean for evidence to be governed well? Now, this framework I produced in an open access book. I'm putting it in the chat now if anyone wants to download it. It has scientific principles, so some of the obvious things about scientific rigor and a high quality evidence, which we know so much about. But also there are democratic principles in terms of how we use evidence. And if you go to the next slide. Now, democratic principles, you might think that our policymakers should be representative and they should be accountable. But again, what I would argue is these are actually linked as well, because we cannot say what is appropriate and good science for policy unless we know what those social goals are, unless we know what values are being pursued. Because if we don't know the outcomes being pursued, we don't know whether or not we're providing the correct science, the relevant science, and therefore the highest quality science. So there needs to be this process where these two sets of normative goals, normative values, both scientific and democratic, speak to each other. And I feel we can build that into our systems. I would argue we need to think about how to do so. Next slide. Again, as I said, this is really fundamentally resting on our idea that policy itself should be in service of the public interest. And this is not a new concept. It dates back to Plato, who argued that we needed to do it, or more recently, public policy scholars like John Dewey. Both of them highlighting the fact that public policymaking can be judged as good quality if it acts on the public's interest. Next slide. And so if we believe that evidence for policy fundamentally means evidence for policies which serve the public interest, we need to institutionalize a system which clarifies that. Which public goals, which social goals are being pursued? Because only then, once we have clarification of those goals, once they're made transparent, only then can we judge whether or not which pieces of evidence are the most relevant ones. And so ultimately, what I argue is that hopefully we can build our evidence systems to improve the democratic functioning by doing so. There might be a number of ways to do that. We heard a lot about citizens' participation in order to gain trust, but also to elucidate their values. But again, that's putting a lot of weight on the citizenry when we still need to have policymakers make explicit which social goals they're pursuing. So we might have those deliberative concepts and those delivered meetings, but then we still need some kind of process by which we get a formal declaration of which goals are being pursued. And then we can know whether the evidence is appropriate. John Labus nicely in an earlier session talked about how science advisors can be seen to coordinate all the different inputs. But I think there's also a role for science advisors to ensure that this goal for clarification takes place. Some people talk about the role of moral experts. For me, a moral expert is not somebody who knows what the right thing to do is in society, but rather we can place a role on certain individuals to highlight where these social goals are being clarified, if we're following the right steps to make clear what outcomes are being pursued on the public's behalf. So it's ultimately a call to build into our institutionalized systems something that more explicitly makes social values clear so that we can hold our decision makers to account in doing so. And I think I'm out of time, so I'll end there. Thank you.
Okay, many thanks, Justin, and that was a very good follow-up to what Peter raised in the role of an advisor to the government, and you identified the link with the good governance processes as a whole. And that follows very nicely, that will be followed very nicely by Natalia's talk, that she will bring some experience related to that. Natalia Kogai is a researcher at the Institute of Applied Economic Research of the Brazilian government. And she's going to talk about real experiences in use of science and evidence in decision-making and how different policies may affect institutionalization and use of health technology assessment. Natalia, you have 5 minutes, but I've also been given a note that you are also required, everyone, to talk a bit more slowly for the sake of translators. I don't know how we can manage that, but that's the challenge for you. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Arash. I have also a PowerPoint. And first of all, I'd like to thank you very much for the opportunity of sharing some thoughts that have been raised there at the Institute of Applied Economic Research in the Brazilian government. And in this talk here, I would like to address this question on how can evidence-informed policymaking practices survive governmental change. Next slide, please. And through some works that I've been carrying out with some colleagues at IPEA, we are looking at one specific context of governmental change. It's a context that Brazil had experienced in the last government from 2019-2022 of a process of democratic backsliding and policy dismantling that used this unscientific position from the political agents against the use of evidence in policy making in order to dismantle some policies. And two areas were more affected, we would say, the health policy and the environmental policy. Because of that, we are looking to two specific policy unities, advice unities, the one that we call CONITEC, which is the National Commission for the Incorporation of Technologies in our NHS, in our Unified Health System. And the second one is the Secretary of the Environmental Quality in our Ministry of Environment. Next slide, please. And two cases suffer some strong attacks. In the case of CONITEC, this attack was more a strike. It was a strike, but also punctual towards the changing of CONITEC recommendation of not using treatments against COVID-19, which were not proven to be effective. In the case of the environmental field, the attacks were more continuous and extensive towards the discontinuation of some specific programs in the field. And the different results of these attacks were that in the CONITEC, despite of the fact of being a momentary destabilization, this system and the unit show it to be resilient. While in the environment unit, it showed to have a powerful effect in dismantle and legitimize this unity in the policy decision making in the field. So what made CONITEC more resilient? And we found different sources of resilience. First of all, CONITEC had its roles, mandates, and process protected by normative frameworks. It also had, besides strong analytical capacities, also relational capacities. And the civil servants show it to be to play an important role there. They are also part of these capacities, but they are also part of the leadership that builds Brazilian HTA network. And because the unit was so embedded in this network and also in continuous communication and partnerships with other stakeholders in the field, such as in the media and professional associations, they managed to receive support when they are attacked. And finally, one important difference was the epistemic status that HCN community showed much higher in comparison to the environment community that we examined. Next slide, please. So to sum up, what have we learned? And the main message that we would like to leave here is that the institutionalization, the case that we examined, was key to the resilience of the evidence-informed policymaking structures in this turbulent political context that we examined. And so basically all the domains that a WHO checklist point out as relevant for institutionalization show it to be some source of the resilience in terms of governance, standard and routinized process, capacities, leadership, partnerships, and culture. So hope it contributed. Back to you, Arash. Thank you very much.
Many thanks indeed, Natalia, and you managed really well by doing both tasks extremely well. And this followed the sort of the discussion also really good. I mean, you gave some real examples of how some of the processes that we call them as part of institutionalization helped the resilience of the structure to support use of evidence in the policymaking. With that, and from Brazil, now we go to Africa, to Uganda, and we're going to listen to Josephine Botera, Assistant Director of the Department of Research Services at the Parliament of Uganda, and she's going again to look at how evidence is being used for public policies in her country. Over to you, you have 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you so much. If my slides can also be put up. And I'm glad that I'm following after, you know, Peter, Justine, Natalia, they have set a good pace. Next. You can move to the next. So this discussion first, I thought that we need to know why this matters. And I thought SDG 16 is a good starting point for us to fully understand why this discussion is actually on. Because we are targeting looking at strong institutions and evidence once put into proper use. I've read books that have been written, for example, by Justine, have proved that they make institutions take decisions in a better way and stronger. So let's move to the next, and I initiate you into what is happening in Uganda. Next slide. You skipped one, just one step back. There's something in between. Oh, something in between. Move to the next. Let me just see if it's ahead. Ahead. Okay, so just to give you a picture of how Uganda has been structured or institutionalized in terms of how evidence flows. I'll start this from the bottom. It's a congested kind of table, but just to take you quickly through. So we have our structures up to the local level, and that's why we are talking about issues of governance. If we sort out our governance, then we are able to cover up the gaps that Peter has mentioned. And from the district level down, we go up to sub-county level. We have formal reporting structures that have been established. And so when we are talking about planning and how policy moves, we have a strong foundation at the bottom before it gets to the point of the ministries and departments, the Ministry of Local Government that oversees all the local governments in the country, the Ministry of Finance that is in charge of funding, and then the Uganda Bureau of Statistics that is in charge of surveys, census, and data management. So we have that foundation that is laid down, and we have a strong involvement of civil society organizations and private sector, including academia, that plays a critical role to fill gaps that require evidence information. And the critical one also that I want to point out here is the role of Office of the Prime Minister. So the Office of the Prime Minister is the lead agency for institutionalization of evaluation in Uganda, and they take lead in collecting information on different programs in terms of evaluation and gathering evidence on performance management of the country and different government departments. The National Planning Authority, on the other side, facilitates the program-based approach to planning And also this is informed by the monitoring and evaluation strategy, the national monitoring and evaluation strategy of the country. So the OPM, Office of the Prime Minister, annually prepares what we call the Government Annual Performance Report, which is considered by the Cabinet, and it compiles the different evaluations that have been undertaken through the year, but also performance issues that relate to different sectors. And this is also considered at Parliament once it has come from Parliament, from Cabinet, it comes to Parliament to inform the changes and the budgeting for the next year. So just on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side of my slide, I'm just putting the nuggets of the different things that are actually taking place within this framework. And I've mentioned that we have the coordination office, which is Office of the Prime Minister. So this is very important in institutionalizing. We have the Civil Society College that trains monitoring and evaluation practitioners in the country. We have the Ministry of Public Service that has properly approved the monitoring and evaluation cadre that is supposed to facilitate collection of information. And then we have the whole of government approach. We have a strong information management system, especially in the Ministry of Health, that is leading, like the second best in the world. We have strong certificates of compliance, both to the planning, but also issues of gender and equity. And we have political champions within the cabinet, but also parliament that enhance use of evidence in policy. So let's move to the next slide. I know I'm left with like 2 minutes. One more. So this slide is just a quick example of where evidence has worked. The previous slide, please. We have an example here of a study that was undertaken in 2017, public sector organization study. Just one more step. I don't know if it's beyond it or behind or in front. Please move one slide ahead. Okay, there, just remain there. So I wanted to just pull out this case study. We held this evaluation as a country in 2017, and it was looking at 20 public sector organizations. The approach was to look at effectiveness and efficiency. And the key finding was that there's a lot of duplication of mandates that is leading to waste and inefficiencies in service delivery. And the big recommendation that was done and structure. And this is one of those studies that I didn't myself think that government is really going to implement. People were very skeptical that government can actually take on this. But where we are today in 2023, we are already seeing a lot of mergers and the redefining of roles for agencies. And this is a very, very good example of where evidence is being used into policy. So there's a lot of changes that have already happened even as we speak. So let me go to my last slide of pathways that work. And this is really to the context of Uganda. I'm going to use only 1 minute on this. So in the 3 phases of evidence, I've looked at in terms of generation. What we require is we have a strong national policy for the public sector and some resources that are allocated specifically into issues of collecting information and evidence. We have a proper national plan and with its national monitoring and evaluation framework that guides how information is collected. We have functional information management systems in the public sector that are facilitating how information flows from the lower local government to the central. We have also considered the importance of, at the level of synthesis, data reliability and credibility. So we have structures also that have been put in place to facilitate evidence storage. The issue of the objectivity and political neutrality has also been factored into our discussion, especially at parliament level. Josephine, and then I go to the last one. I'm going to the last one. This is my last one. Yes, this is the last one. In terms of communicating evidence, we've realized the importance of evaluation champions or evidence use champions. And we have some of these champions within the Office of the Prime Minister, the Office of the President, but also within Parliament, who facilitate the use of reports and policies and evaluations that have come through to inform policy. Thank you so much. I'm sorry I took more time, but my slides kept shifting. Apologies. Thank you. I hand over.
Thank you very much. And The slides are also available to all the participants, and they can refer to valuable information you provided within those. So now I have the pleasure to invite the last speaker. So moving from Uganda to Oman, and Dr. Sultan Al-Sabahi, knowledge translation and health economics expert, specialist within the Directorate General of Planning and Studies within the Ministry of Health of Oman. So from Sultana, we hear a bit about Oman, but also about some theorization of institutionalization and the work of WHO in those areas. And for that, Sultana, you have 7 minutes, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Arash, and thanks to all of my colleagues and to the participants who joined with us the third day. So I will try to make this simple and light and quick, hopefully. Next slide, please. So we have been talking from the beginning of this session about institutionalization. So it might be good to remind ourselves what we mean by institutionalizations, because it might still mean different things for different people, but the essence of it, it's to know that it is a process as much as it is an outcome. So you need to think about both. So you are in that process of creating, maintaining, and reinforcing norms, regulation, and standards, and standardize the practice. The endpoints that you want to make sure that the evidence to become over time, the legitimate and taken for granted part for the health policy making process. So that's the ultimate goal when we talk about institutionalizations. And as we have been hearing in the last 2 days, the importance of collaboration and communications, because in the process and the outcome of institutionalizing evidence-informed policy making, our ultimate goal is to make sure that the knowledge producers and the knowledge utilizers are in a good terms. The communication is theirs to bridge that gap between knowledge and action. Next, please. So on the Sultanate of Oman, we have a couple of factors that came together in our journey to institutionalize evidence-informed policy making. So as Peter has mentioned, the role of institutions in Oman, we have like a couple of institutions that have been already in place. We have departments for planning, Center for Studies and Research, health economics, and we have a lot of administrative data. So this work as the base and the bedrock for upholding all of the efforts that guided our process to institutionalize the effort of evidence-informed policy making. At the same time, this was coupled with a couple of international strategic documents which work as the compacts for the journey. We have Oman Vision 2040 and the Health Vision 2050, plus the diffusion of ideas regarding the importance of evidence-informed policy making. For example, before 2 years, there was the summit where all of the health ministers were involved to reflect on their experience regarding utilizing evidence during COVID. So all of that came together to help in making a progress in the process of institutionalizing evidence-informed policy making. And we backed that with a couple of raising awareness sessions, especially in the tertiary hospitals, which holds the largest number of employees there. And we were surprised how much the people were fascinated and interested to know more about the topic, and to share with them that the evidence-based or evidence-informed is not just restricted to the clinical practice, but this is also expanded to the health system, to all policies and decision as well. We also faced a lot of change in the cabinets at the ministry level and at the country levels, where new peoples came and they were coupled with the interest of evidence-informed policy making, and a lot of them were researchers who would like to see their research converted into action. Next, please. So putting all of this together, this created a lot of opportunities for Oman, especially when new peoples came. Also, they have an experience, they have the ability to network and communicate and connect with the academia, plus the existing infrastructures and institutions. This was definitely not free of the challenges. We, as everyone else, face the challenge of limited resources, capable peoples, also some access to some of the evidence, and the fragmentations, which is the biggest challenge, and we are still working on it. The main important things, next please, when we think about institutionalization, there are 6 main domains that we need to think about. Governance, and I like the way that Justin had put this. It's not about the institutions per se, but it is the governance of the whole system of supporting evidence-informed policy making, including which social value we are going to serve. So we need to standardize the process, and this is where we are still facing a challenge. Yes, we have a couple of people who have an interest, even these are people with power, but it is not yet standardized across all institutions, across all situations. So we need also to work, the third domain is partnership and collaborations, and we are definitely improving in this area. The leadership and commitments is very, very important. And as I mentioned, now the change in the governments we have a lot of support from the leaderships and people with from the higher authority. Resources, as much as it might be challenging, but this also can be mitigated with the partnerships and collaborations. And the last one is the culture. So there's a culture which should be across all levels, like researchers, stakeholders, and policymakers. Next, please. So an important message is that institutionalization for evidence-informed policymaking is a journey. And in this journey, you should expect back and forth movements. It is not a straight line, but you can say it is a flat ground. You should expect not all of us will start from the same starting points. It might be uninstituted, it might be at pre-institutionalization, semi-institutionalization, re-institutionalize, or de-institutionalize. For example, whenever you are trying to institutionalize a new norms and culture and way of thinking, like evidence-informed policy making, that's mean equally you should expect you will need to re-institutionalize or de-institutionalize a pre-existing cultures and thought. So some of the things you will need to work on them equally. Next, please. So the message, that's multiple stage you will face. Not all of us will start from the same stage, depending on where we are and depending what we have already in the grounds. But just put in mind these 4 stages and combine them with the 6 domains. And it doesn't mean you will need equal component of each domain in each stage. The component you will need from each one will differ, again, depending on what you have. But just put these together, the 4 stages with the 6 domains, and I have the source for this, the checklist, which has been prepared by WHO, as well as the 6 domains paper. The reference is available there, and a lot of details and important information can be found there. 4 stages and 6 domains. So next, please. So finally, I would like to conclude by saying that evidence-informed policymaking institutionalization is the story of turning evidence into tradition, relationship into progress, and challenges into stepping stone. It's a tale told in governance, woven in standards, and carried forward by commitments, a tale that will be passed down, a legacy of healthier nation. Thank you very much.
Many thanks indeed, Sultana. That was a great ending to the presentation that colleagues have made so far. And the theoretical framework also helped to bring different streams of discussion together. So before I start raising some of the questions from the panelists, I also would like to acknowledge that now I see that Mark is back with us, so he was disconnected for a couple of minutes, and Tanya on his behalf opened the day, so he's the host of the day. Please connect with him also in the chat if you have queries or discussions there. So there has been several questions raised in the question and answer, and also within the chat itself. My colleagues Roberta, Laura, and Mehnaz have tried to categorize some of those questions, and obviously we cannot answer or raise all of those. And I've selected few that we go through them one by one. And I'm asking colleagues, please try to answer in 1 minute if possible. So the first question is from Peter. And it's a sort of maybe provocative question, is that can policy advisors be openly active in national politics? And if yes or no, how does that affect their work?
Well, I personally believe that it's critical that the science advisor is apolitical and independent. The second that they are political, I think there are problems. And I think we've got to go back to a point that's not been made. Most policy making in the end is values-based. It may be informed by evidence, but as Justin said, it's actually values-based on the issues of all sorts of priorities within a democracy. And I think that therefore, the role of the science advisor or the science advisory mechanism is to give the evidence that helps, that underpins the values decisions that ultimately always occur. There's always a values decision, because there's usually money involved. The other point that I think it's important to make, which we've not made, is that there is often a tension between the science advisor and the policy community. The policy community worries that the science advisor is doing their job, which is to evaluate the values-based components. And therefore, there's a real importance on having people who are skilled like translators are skilled to understand the interface between policy and the science community. And finally, I just want to say the worst aspect of science advice is when the science advisor says, Prime Minister, you have a problem, and leaves it to the politician to find the solution. Science advice works best when the advisors are actually giving the policymaker an evidence-based solution to the problem that's identified. So I'll stop. And then the only other point I want to make, which has not been made, is not every expert is a good broker, knowledge broker. There's many situations where I had to intervene because the expert was not able to translate to the policymaker what they were really trying to say.
Many thanks, and I'm sure there are plenty other issues to highlight, but these are some very key points. So from that, I go to Justin, and there were few questions related to some of the issues you highlighted. The one I would like you to focus on, please, is related to the issue of the methods and transparency in the methods. And sort of, I mean, what are the concerns there? What are the key elements that should be followed? And your reflection on that, please.
So I'm not 100% sure I understand the question about the methods.
Yeah, the question is, so when we talk about transparency in decision-making as part of evidence-informed decision-making, what about transparency in the methodology that is behind the generation of the evidence and the development of the policy options that are coming forward? So what are the key criteria to be considered?
Okay. So I don't know if I thought actually that much about the methodologies involved in the generation of evidence, but certainly what I would say is that it would be very useful to have greater scrutiny. And this is where I think science advisors or perhaps nominated experts on methods can clarify how the generation of evidence fundamentally shapes what is being considered, how we structure our data gathering. The types of studies we do fundamentally sets the way problems are defined and the way solutions are either incorporated into what we consider or excluded. And the construction of our research, the construction of our questions has profound political implications. The way we count people, the way we classify people, the outcome variables that we either include in a study or exclude. So I think there actually is, a very important role for individuals within an advisory system to clarify what is being included and what is being excluded from the types of methods we use. And so I think it's all I would say to that is that, yes, that I think it's very important to have that explicit, basically a process or an individual tasked with following a process to make those assumptions clear and transparent and explicit rather than leaving it implicit, which often is done when we, for example, if we defer to randomized controlled trials, we're going to defer towards things that the pharmaceutical industry has prioritized and that certain funders, and we're going to exclude things which are not conducive to randomized trials, like social change and broader public health goals and the like. And so having an individual who can make those assumptions in our methods transparent, I think plays a very important role in improving the governance, improving the use of evidence.
Many thanks indeed. And perhaps also, I mean, a differentiation between when we are talking of clinical questions and sort of more social policy-related questions, where, for example, even if you have primary studies, the methodologies, they may use some of the methodology using the clinical questions or may not, but then the issue becomes how to make the processes also remain transparent when they interpret the science related for policy advice. So, I mean, by that, I mean, Natalie, a question from you is the sort of the question wasn't addressed from any of the speakers, but I think it's a good question perhaps for you, if I hope I'm not making the bad judgment here, but they're asking what do you see the role of journalists here, the people who deal with the media that may also reflect the views of the public, they may interpret the science, they may also be part of the political lobby or political decision making.
Thank you very much, Arash. Very interesting question. In the case that we examined, both in environment and in the health on COVID-19 context, we saw all these sorts of roles, actually. But I believe in terms of challenges to improve the use of evidence in policymaking, in Brazil, they are playing an important role. Some of them were trying to be like translators, like brokers for the society. We know that this kind of situation of climate change and pandemics brings a lot of uncertainty throughout the community, the society, and they've managed in some level to reduce that by bringing information, by translating information coming from the science, and also trying to, it was interesting, one of the interviews said, well, we were not in the news for the last decades, someone from the environment field, but now they are putting us in the headlines. The same happened in this Conitech contest. They were never in the news, but in this context, they put into the spotlight the importance of the policy advice and the use of science. So I think they can play important roles, yes.
Many thanks, Natalia, that was very clear. Josephine, there is a very specific question from you, is that you refer to the role of champions. So can you talk a bit about what qualifications you see there, especially based on practice? What works, what doesn't work?
Yeah, thank you so much. And when it comes to champions, they're more at the tail end, at the point of dissemination. So they are the ones supposed to drum and speak loud that this is what we have, and this is where we want change to be happening. So in our context, we've seen when like the speaker mentioned something on the floor of the House, we've seen when the Prime Minister comes out and says, according to this evaluation, this is what has emerged. There's more listening. There's more, concentration by the cabinet. On the side of the technical, the champions that we have at the country level is it's a committee called National Monitoring and Evaluation Technical Working Group. And this working group does gatekeeping between the evaluators and the cabinets and ministries. They do the sieving of what information has come through from an evaluation, do peer review, and then forward this to the relevant offices of government that needs to influence change or make adjustments to their policies. Thank you.
And many thanks, indeed, Josephine. So, Sultana, I mean, there were a couple of questions related to, issues of culture, which could be, you may need much more than 1 minute to address that one, but I want to go into a more specific question, and especially by your role within Ministry of Health, and you also refer to a structure within the Ministry of Health. So the question is about when the structures become silos, how to avoid those. Even sometimes the processes that are generated might generate silos. So what's your piece of advice on that? What are the key considerations?
So there are multiple things that can be taken here into considerations. And the first one, it's now how we create the balance between being specialized versus working in silos. So having a system that will ensure a proper transparency and a proper engagements for all of the stakeholders who are relevant. That's very important in that. Yes, we have a structure who will be specialized, and that will mainly be like providing the different kind of data, but it is not necessarily those who generate the data will be the ultimate end users of the data. So now, for example, here in the ministries, we try to mitigate the challenge of working in silos by creating a lot of time, like, a task force or committees to bring relevant bodies into that task force and into that committees, and to make sure that the peoples and the relevant bodies will keep working together.
Yeah, many thanks indeed. So we are about 5 minutes to the end of the session. So I'm going to, defer the rest of the questions to the chat discussion and the follow-up. I would like to thank all the panel members for excellent, timely, relevant discussion from different countries, different perspectives, and different experiences. Peter, Justin, Natalia, Josephine, and Sultana. Many thanks to all of you. And now I have the pleasure to hand over to the co-chair of the session, Dr. Mehnaz Khairandis, who is the Regional Advisor for Evidence and Data to Policy in the Eastern Mediterranean Regional Office of the WHO. Mehnaz, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Arash. Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I would like to thank the esteemed panelists, the co-chair of the session, and all the participants from across the globe for an interesting discussion and sharing thoughts and ideas with us. Just to summarize the main messages from this session, as we discussed, institutionalization refers to establishing organizational structures, mechanisms, and processes that enables the legitimate and routine use of evidence to inform policymaking processes. It was also mentioned that institutionalization relies on building relationships and interactions between the relevant stakeholders that is called evidence ecosystem. That means the formal and informal linkages and interactions between different actors and overlap between two distinct systems, the research system and the evidence support system. We also heard from panelists that this alignment and linkage, how can be effective in avoiding or reducing at least inefficiency in the system and its function. It was said that the institutional capacity for evidence-informed policymaking refers to the extent of knowledge, skills, and commitment of individuals and groups of people, as well as the organizational mandate, culture, structures and processes that allows evidence taken for granted as a part of health policy making, as we heard also from Oman. We highlighted the importance of defining the goals and objectives and the social value to identify and use the best relevant evidence and science to inform decision making. And we heard today that the climate for evidence-informed policymaking and the high-level commitment play important role in fostering the agenda at the national level and seeing the impact on the ground, as we heard from experiences also from Brazil, Oman, New Zealand, and Uganda. We discussed that to ensure the responsiveness and representative decision-making processes, we need to institutionalize evidence-informed policymaking in the country. However, there are still many challenges exist. For example, lack of technical expertise and collaboration between relevant programs and systems are among the big and main ones. To solve this challenge, countries need to assess their needs and capacities and formulate a suitable strategy for use of evidence in health policy making, considering their national context and their national setting. This needs a multidimensional approach that helps establishment of the programs and processes to identify priority health topic and the best available evidence for effective interventions. And this should be done through establishing a structural and programmatic linkages between different streams of evidence support mechanisms while avoiding inefficiencies and inconsistencies, as we discussed and we heard from dear panelists today. So we believe institutionalization of using evidence for decision-making is a must to achieve universal health coverage and resilient health system in a sustainable way. With this, I would like to bring the session to a close and thank you all. Thank you so much. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, and hello to everybody. And thank you, dear panelists, and Arash and Mermas for this very important discussion, I think, on the institutionalization and the creation. I think you have brought some challenging and interesting points. I experienced some evidence on traffic roads and cables and internet connections. My apologies for that, but I am back. In order to keep a little bit and continue this very important community building, global wide, creating people, bringing people together, I want to actually bridge to the next session. Yeah, I hope and I'm sure that the discussion will be as enjoyable and as interesting in order to strengthen this community. And I want to introduce now the moderators of the second panel, which is discussing issues of collaboration, but also supporting the collaboration with artificial intelligence and aspects related to that. And I want to introduce Carla Sainz, who will be moderating, which is an advisor, and Ludovic Rewijs, which is a regional advisor of the Scientific Evidence and Health Research Management, which are both from the Pan-American Health Organization of WHO Regional Office for the Americas. Carla, Ludovic, up to you.
Many thanks, Mark, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. It is my pleasure to be the moderator with Carla for this session on unlocking the potential of artificial intelligence and foresight for evidence-informed policy. Foresight aims to prepare governments and societies with the capacity to contextually explore and prepare for the future in order to navigate and adapt and shape the future through better policies. Artificial intelligence has the transformative power to process data, provide predictive insights, streamline decision-making, and personalize interventions, revolutionizing evidence-informed policymaking. Artificial intelligence methods, including machine learning and deep learning, are used to enable the full and semi-autonomous performance of one or more stages in the development of evidence synthesis and policymaking. So most of all are not expert on artificial intelligence and foresight. And so I think that this session is really an opportunity to learn more. The main objective of this session is to inspire all of you to engage with foresight and artificial intelligence tools and technologies actively and ethically, thereby fostering a better understanding of the various ways in which foresight and artificial intelligence can unlock new possibilities and advancements in evidence-informed policy, as well as the importance to understand its limitations and risk. So may I introduce to you our first speaker, Dr. Marit Volt. Dr. Volt is Director of Public Health and Health Services at the Dutch National Institute for Public Health and Environment in the Netherlands. The title of her presentation is Foresight, a Beacon for Public Health Policy. We welcome Dr. Volp. Dr. Volp, you may begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, for most of you. And thank you so much for the invite for this summit. I have only 5 minutes to explain our national efforts on foresighting as a beacon for public health policy making. So I'll try to speed up. If I can have the next slide, please. Thank you. First of all, a short introduction to the Dutch National Institute of Public Health and the Environment. We have over 2,000 employees. We are part of the Ministry of Health, but our independency is guaranteed by a law, by the what's called in Dutch the RIVM Act. So we advise, but we are independent. So we are not spokes organization for the Ministry of Health, but we advise, and we do so using our knowledge. And one of the ways in which we advise the Ministry of Health is via foresighting. So maybe the next slide, please. Yes, so why foresight studies? Because this also may sound a bit like fortune telling, which is absolutely not the case. But we know the future is uncertain, but policymaking is about influencing future situations, or at least trying to. We need to identify future societal challenges in order to see by action now we can influence the future. So anticipating trends and changes, desirable but also undesirable, is very, very important for policymaking. And in order to review and assess strategies, policymaking, we use knowledge. And one of the ways to use knowledge is via the foresight method. And the foresighting is systematic, participatory, future intelligence gathering, and medium to long-term vision building. And that process enables present-day decisions and mobilizing joint actions to influence the future. It's not like fortune telling or future, well, with a lot of smoke and the merry-go-round, but it is evidence-based. Next slide, please. So how do we do that? This is like a schematic slide. There's a whole range of futures and possible futures that we can look at. And a common one is the most likely future, or forecast, like weather forecast, for example, where there's not too much uncertainty. And a way to deal with the uncertainty is to look at future scenarios. So you could make several scenarios for the most likely future, the desirable future, for worst case future situations. And more recently, we see, at least in the Netherlands, that there's more attention to what's desirable and desirable future scenarios, especially to, if you regard public health. So in which way can we influence the future by policy making now? So what levers we have to adjust to get the desirable future. Next slide, please. In general, foresight futures are we facing? What scenarios do we think are lying ahead? And this compromises methods like horizon scanning and scenario making. The second one is like, what are the most important challenges? What are the main challenges? And these are, for example, policy goals. And as we know, we might not always agree which policy goals to prioritize. So by pointing out the important challenges and focusing on future scenarios and checking current policies and seeing in which way they influence future scenarios, we help policymakers to decide. And as you know, we just give the evidence, we just show them the possibilities, but the decision making is somewhere else. That's governmental, and that has to do with politics. And the last question is what kind of options there are for actions. So what can we do? What different options do we have now to get different outcomes in the future? Next slide, please. One of our, we always call it crown jewels, is the Dutch Public Health Foresight Study, which is legally based. So we deliver every 4 years edition of the Dutch Public Health Foresight Study, and we have been doing that for over almost 30 years. And the last foresight study was a very special one because that was in the midst of COVID. So that was a special edition. Next year, we hope to deliver the 13th edition. And so what is the Dutch Public Health Foresight Study? It's a strategic foresight study, as I said, every 4 years. And it's a very important basis for national and local public health policy. Like, for example, the Public Health Memorandum, but we also see that local governments are using the foresight study for their local policy making. And how do we do that? Well, this is a participative stakeholder process. So we do not do this alone, and it's not only theoretical, but we have a range of stakeholder processes that are bound together to predict, to make this foresight. And it's also a broad approach of health, for example, health in all policies, but also, and we have like seen this all summer, climate change and health. The base of this foresight study is a very strong quantitative epidemiological basis. Next slide, please. What has this 30-year period of foresighting in the Netherlands learned us? Well, what we see is that by identifying challenges and supporting evidence-informed policy making, policy strategies have an evidence-based funding. So they are not only politically informed, but they are based on evidence. We do account for uncertainty. As I mentioned, COVID was an uncertainty which had a great influence on our foresight and also the outcomes. And we do use technology like artificial intelligence. What's important also to make the normative aspects explicit, promote discussion. It's not like if you do A, you get B as an outcome, but there are lots of insecurities. So promote a discussion on the uncertainties. And it's also, after 30 years, still a work in progress, and we are still developing. So to sum up, that is why we think it's very important to join forces, to work together, and we are very much looking forward to making an even stronger connection with AFINET and to join forces with WHO. Next slide, please. To sum up 30 years of experience and with foresighting is quite difficult. If you want more information, I would like you to take a look at the website of RFM. There's also an English website page, and our main expert on this topic is Henk Hildering. Unfortunately, he couldn't be at this meeting and asked me to present. But if you want more to know more, do contact him, and he would be very happy to answer all of your questions. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dr. Loeb. So we have time for only one question and a quick response, which is, what are some practical steps that government and organization can take to foster a culture of foresight and future-oriented thinking within their institutions? If you can provide a very short answer to the question. Thanks so much.
Yes, well, in a way, we are quite lucky. So we have a legal base, but I would like you to see if it's possible to get a legal base for a foresighting study. So that's, I think, if you could influence politicians or the ministries, because it's a very important add-on for policymakers use. So, and if you want more information about the legal status, we will happily provide that to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Volp. So our next three panelists will discuss best practices and experience in the application of artificial intelligence tools and methods for evidence synthesis and policy making. So we welcome Professor Julian Elliott. Julian is from Cochrane, Australia, and co-founder and CEO of Future Evidence Foundation. He is a professor at the School of Public Health and Preventive Medicine at Monash University in Australia. He will present on how will AI change evidence-informed policymaking. Thank you, Julian. Go ahead, please. We can hear you.
Excellent. Thank you, Ludovic, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak today. So next slide. So in full transparency, I'll present here my interests, but I think Ludovic has already summarized these. Next slide. So this is a figure of the evidence ecosystem, I think probably familiar to all of you. If you think of where we start at producing evidence at 9 o'clock on the clock, we then synthesize that evidence, create guidance and health technology assessments, disseminate to policymakers, clinicians, and patients, implement, and then evaluate and improve practice. And then, of course, through that, generate new questions and new research studies. So with the increasing application of artificial intelligence, we're going to see two major changes across this ecosystem. Next. So first of all, we're going to see the acceleration of each of these steps. So here in the blue in the boxes. So each step will be accelerated through the increasing application of AI systems. But perhaps more profoundly, there will also be the development of actual AI-based products and services in each of these steps. So of course, when we think about in primary research, AI will accelerate healthcare research, for example, pharmaceutical development, but also accelerate the development of AI-based systems, diagnostics, devices, prediction, etc. Similarly, in health technology assessment and regulatory review, there will be some efficiency opportunities, but also, of course, the challenge which regulatory agencies are already grappling with in the regulation of AI-based products. Next slide. So I just want to now focus on evidence synthesis. So when we're thinking about evidence synthesis, of course, there's many different products and services in this space. And I think a useful way of thinking about this is to think about these two attributes, quality and currency. So we have many products as exemplified by systematic reviews that are very rigorous, high quality, and so therefore a solid basis for decision-making. They have high trust. But of course, the challenge is keeping them up to date. So they're often out of date. So high quality, but perhaps low currency. And then in contrast, we have many different mechanisms for what we might call quick and dirty approaches to evidence synthesis. So talking to an expert, a rapid review, a very quick scan of the literature. So these might give us some idea about the most recent research, But of course, many, many studies have documented that they are more prone to bias, therefore lower quality and lower trust. And ultimately, living evidence tries to break this trade-off and create forms of evidence that are both high quality and up to date with the latest research. So AI will accelerate and disrupt all these forms of evidence synthesis. Next slide. So if we think first of the types of evidence products that are perhaps in that quick and dirty part of the matrix, this is already being disrupted. So if we think of ChatGPT, and similar sort of products, sometimes called conversational AI products, where you can have a question and answer type interaction, I think they are already here. They are already a new form of quick and dirty evidence. We know that policymakers need access to evidence quickly and easily. And in addition to the existing rapid methods I described, conversational AI, I'm sure, is already being used in the offices of governments, policymakers, political officers, in order to give people a very quick, instant, rough understanding of research in a particular area. But we're really only at the beginning of this. I think we will see in the coming months and years an explosion of these kinds of products, some of which will be particularly targeting high impact decision makers. And so there are many, many challenges in this space. Of course, accuracy is a key challenge. The language models and the generative AI that are underpinning these products do not really have a fundamental concept of accuracy. So this is a key challenge. Of course, there are many, many people working on this to try to improve accuracy, but it remains a really fundamental challenge. There is, of course, the challenge of bias. These systems are built by humans. Humans are biased, and so their biases are become part of these products as well. And then, of course, there's very, very significant issues around transparency and explainability. These are essentially black box systems, and it's very difficult to have any form of transparency or explainability, although, of course, people are also working on this. So I think in the end, this is going to be a very rich, active, contested, and chaotic space for the way that research evidence connects to policy making. And we have to be realistic that this has already arrived and think very carefully about how we might be able to define and shape and incentivize better products that perhaps meet certain performance requirements that we might define for the use of these kind of quick and dirty products in policy making. Next slide. AI will also accelerate the semi-automation of systematic review. Systematic review is more like a research study than a literature review. It's very systematic, codified, and rigorous. Up until now, AI or machine learning has really under-delivered for systematic review. There's actually very few models that are well used or widely deployed in systematic review. But the advent of these really powerful large language models will accelerate the use of these systems in systematic review. I think the important concept here is semi-automation. It will really be the combination of machine and human effort for the individual tasks that together comprise a systematic review. And so there are, again, challenges here in terms of accuracy, bias, transparency, explainability. But ultimately, I think here there's really extraordinary opportunities for the scaling and adoption of more efficient and ultimately living forms of evidence synthesis. Next slide. And so I just want to finish in emphasizing one of the key messages that I and other commissioners within the Global Commission on Evidence to Address Societal Challenges have been making, which is that within evidence systems, we have to think very carefully about the evidence demand and supply coordination mechanisms. And one of our recommendations is that we think carefully about what we're calling a general contractor model. So capabilities within government or closely adjacent that are very well versed in all the different forms of evidence and the different technologies and data sciences that can be used to support evidence-informed policymaking, to help policymakers navigate what I think is going to become a much more complex and disrupted space over the coming years. Next slide. And next, thank you. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to some of the discussions and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Elliott, for sharing your vision on the big picture of AI and evidence-informed policy. We'll have our question and answer after our next two panelists. We are pleased to have Dr. Mendes Nen. He is the Chief of Artificial Intelligence Office at the International Digital Health and AI Research Collaborative in Switzerland. Dr. Nen will present on AI-driven evidence extraction for informed policymaking from real-world data to real-world evidence. Please, Dr. Nen.
Thank you so much, dear colleagues, and thank you for the invitation. What I'm be presenting today is a synthesis of a couple of experiments that we have been through in the couple of last years, especially during the COVID crisis, and how we have been able to deploy the AI for specifically the extraction of real-world evidence from real-world data. Next slide, please. On the journey of the AI for evidence-based policy, we have been facing this dual commitment. The first is about how to comprehend and define the boundaries of AI, and the second, how that we need to define and benchmark the validation of such usage of AI in policymaking. In fact, on one hand, there's echo. Sorry, let me get closer. On one hand, AI offers multiple opportunities to explore data, such as the unstructured, big, synthetic, or real-world data, but also the unconventional data. And on the other hand, we need to define a kind of responsible and ethical rules of AI usage, taking into consideration the bias, the fairness, and the effectiveness and the perception of the results that are getting outside of the AI and the data exploitation. From our perspective, unconventional and unstructured big data in particular is a very exciting playground for AI, given its complexity and the limited use of such data in conventional approach. Then the next slides will be mostly about the usage of these kind of unconventional and unstructured data. Next slide, please. You can see that, in fact, AI holds a promise in that field, especially when it comes to the computing and analyzing a large amount of real-world data, which are often complex and lack structure, but holds untold insights. However, traditional approaches face challenges when dealing with these data formats, and AI can come to the forefront as a force for tackling these challenges. Leveraging different techniques such as natural language processing, topics modeling, large language models, we have different set of tools to decode this data. For example, NLP helps us unveil text by revealing its core message. Topics modeling uncovers hidden themes and patterns within the data counts. CNN and large language models can enhance this capability by handling inputs. Predictive analytics further amplifies our capabilities to providing insights from the outcomes. This vision of techniques empower us to navigate through the complexity of real-world data, converting it slowly into real-world evidence. Next slide, please. So if you take the example of the COVID and the pandemic, we can see that there is a large, complex set of data existing that need to be considered in order to generate these AI and evidence extractions from these data. If you look at the pandemic, we have these sources from the origin of data, but also the context of the data. So if we begin with real data, we can see that firstly, we have kind of scientific data where we have the virus transmission rates, fatality numbers, number of admissions, and these are very essential metrics that form the heart of the pandemic study. However, we must also consider the population perception reflected much more in real-time data, which are often very hard to integrate in the data analysis without using AI. We have also the data and information coming from the interventions and the implementation of these interventions. And here where things can be very interesting. With the AI, we can really extract and incorporate population subjective data into the equation, and that will help us unlocking a higher level of understanding. And in fact, by placing the needs and perception of the population at the core of health policy formulation, we can reshape our public health policy approach. This will help encourage the acceptance of intervention, but also reveals difference between different acceptance level and hesitancy, and that could help us in providing strategies to bridge these gaps. There is clear shift happening there in this in integrating AI and perception data, and this will introduce the move the policies towards a prioritization of the needs and perception of individuals, and could bring a major change in public health policy making. And it's a step towards more personalized approach of public health policy tailored to better fit within different existing profiles and clusters of the population, and to overcome the existing approach where one solution fits all. Next slide, please. A practical use case of implementation will be showcased quickly is the implementation focused on understanding population perception during the pandemic. We all heard about this perception and misinformation, but clearly how AI helped in doing that. This is an example of implementation we've deployed during the COVID crisis. We adopted a very pragmatic AI approach by utilizing a named entity recognition process. This process encompasses multiple stages. We collect text from diverse sources, label text samples to identify key elements like test, positive, and results. And subsequently, we train our AI model on these labeled samples. The refined model underwent meticulous curation and to enhance accuracy. And once we attain acceptable accuracy level, the model was deployed to efficiently process our data sets. And then that brings a couple of insights from the population perceptions. Next slide, please. And then the integration of these NER-driven model with existing sentiment analysis model brings a more comprehensive understanding of the population perception. By combining these techniques, we can not only extract key elements, but also gauge, for example, the percentage of acceptance and hesitancy within the population. Additionally, we can identify prevalent misinformation and disinformation topics, providing a crucial lens into the factors influencing public opinion. This holistic approach enables us to quantify potential risks associated with certain perception and equipping us with the valuable insights to proactively address and manage population concern. Next slide, please. So there are many other examples other than during the COVID, and then the AI potential spans far beyond this particular application. We can talk about AI-driven algorithms to optimize distribution of limited resources during crisis time, or the AI micro-targeting for driving social behavior change and launching effective public health campaigns, or the utilization of predictive analytics in the strategic deployment of vaccination campaign, enabling healthcare to allocate resources effectively. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, and to boost AI into forefront of evidence-based policy, we advocate for a comprehensive framework comprising three crucial phases, which are analytics, the design, and impact. Each of these steps demands significant development to bridge the gap between technological innovation and policy implementation. This advancement necessitates and requires collaborative efforts involving diverse stakeholders and actors who harness the disruptive power of AI to shape the trajectory of future of public health evidence making. Thank you.
Many thanks for the interesting presentation, Dr. Menhi. So our next speaker is Dr. Eduardo Barbosa Coelho. He's Associate Professor of the Ribeirão Preto Medical School. University of Sao Paulo, Brazil. His presentation will highlight the application of AI tools to solve big data analysis with examples including COVID-19 pandemic. Go ahead, please, Eduardo. Thank you.
Thank you, Ludovic. Thank you for invitation to join the panel section. It's an honor to me. Next slide, please. I will, in the next minute, talk about the use of AI tool in development of a strategy to mining and processing data from electronic health records. Next, please. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. To me, sorry. Back, please. The back slide, please.
I think you have a delay. So maybe what you're trying to show is the CRF, isn't it?
Okay, maybe my internet connection is not good.
Yeah. So
can you go back, please?
Stay there because it's probably the CRF that he wants to show.
Okay, thank you. Okay, can you go here? So I think that the use of a tool is obligatory in doing big data research due to the large volume of data. I will illustrate the potential of the AI, showing the strategy using here in Brazil to get COVID-19 data to feed the WHO Global Clinical Platform of COVID-19. Our strategy uses a tool based on the deep learning, neural networks, and natural processing language. And this tool helps solve two main tasks: search and extract data from the electronic health record systems to belong to a network of Brazilian public hospitals. As you can see here in this slide, the CRF from WHO platforms have a lot of information to be filled. A major part of such data is written in clinical notes and is difficult to obtain using digital extraction tools. Next, please. Next slide, please. Okay. The point is the amount. The second point is the amount of data to be extracted. For example, in Brazil, a public company, EBSER, manages 41 teaching hospitals. As you can see, the hospitals are spread in Brazil and have registered until October 2022 more than 40,000 cases of COVID-19. Next slide, please. To solve this big challenge to have this data extracted, and we decided to make a partnership with a startup involved in the development of AI tools focused on finding participants for clinical trials. There's such a tool named the Smart Health Connector, SHC, deciphers and structures and unstructured clinical texts. Next slide, please. In the next slide, this is in the interface of SHC. This is the pilot database used only for training machine learning algorithms, but you have real data from EBSER. In the data bank, we found, using COVID-19 as a filter, around 5,000 cases, and I will show you in highlighted case in the left and the right part of the screen. One case and how the IA2 works. Next, please. You can see at the top of the slide. Okay. The timeline of the clinical notes. In the middle of the figure, you can see the work of the AI tool. The system reads the clinical notes, found and classify as possible present or absent signs, symptoms, or other information of interest, and that are noted in clinical notes, of course. And this data is important and could be shared in Excel tables, for example, for further analysis. The interesting thing of this tool too is the generate codes. If you find, for example, a disease, they could attribute the IC, the international code, and export this code for further analysis. Next slide, please. I think that my colleagues addressed a lot of limitations of the use of these strategies. Have a more important concerns regarding ethics and bias, but you know that extracting analyzing a large amount of data is an expensive and time-consuming process without the use of such tools. In conclusion, and I will finish here, the strategy has much to improve, but the use of the AI in health research, I suppose, is a path of no return. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry for the delay in my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eduardo, for the very interesting presentation. So we're a little bit ahead of time, so we're going to get into the number of questions. So we have received many questions. Many of them are related with ethical aspects, and Carla Sanz is our regional bioethical advisor here at PAHO. But I'll start with, and I try to incorporate many questions in this first one. So the importance to understand AI limitations and the risk, the importance to reconcile black box predictions on AI with interpretable models and human experts. And at the end, how do you assess the quality and how do you interpret what is generated by existing digital content products and AI? So that would be the first question. Julian, if you want to start. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Ludovic. It's a great question. So I think just very briefly, we should think of this in kind of two categories. AI-based systems that are essentially directed to the end users of evidence, let's say in this case, policymakers, where they're interacting with a tool or product that is giving them some sort of answer, as it were, or summary. And there, I think the question around interpretability, transparency is very important and very difficult to solve. Again, there are many companies working on this now, but these are essentially black box systems. But I think as a global policy-making community, and I think there's been some comments here, there is an opportunity, I think, to try to engage with this challenge and define the requirements for these systems, particularly in use in high-impact policymaking, to create a sense of a benchmark that companies can work to. So that would be one category. I think the other category is where these systems are involved in the automation or semi-automation of specific steps in evidence synthesis. So, for example, screening of citations in a systematic review. And I think here we need both some agreement across the significant organizations in this field around the level of performance, again, required by these models. For example, an accuracy of 99%. And then we need to demand robust validation and evaluation studies before these models are widely implemented and used.
Thank you, Julian. So the next question is for Dr. Mehdi. So what could help you do that AI-generated content and AI-generated products become commonplace? And if you want to add to the previous question, brief remarks, that would be also great. We are really, yeah, if you can have a very short.
Yeah, I'll have a very short answer. So we are just at the beginning. So we are currently benchmarking ourselves against ourselves for the moment, because we do not have enough track records to be able to evaluate the effectiveness and efficiency of our models that are being built, especially when it comes to the policy making. Most of the work or the comparison of our work is done against or in compared to classical approaches, systematic review, as Gillian was saying, and that's unfair, because that's completely different approach, and that's completely different process there. And at some point, we need to reach maturity where we can benchmark different models, existing models, in, for example, in evidence extractions against each other, which is not the case for the moment, since it's very exploratory and it's still in the research space rather than in the development space. So that's something. Second thing, I think it's we need to really emphasize the importance of responsible AI, the intention of development, the cycle and stewardship of the AI products that need to be on the market, but also the obsolescence. There is obsolescence inside of the data, but also obsolescence inside of the model. We just discovered that the ChatGPT is recently being in the obsolescence side and delivering less good questions than at the answers than at the early beginning. So we need to bring in the governance models that we are building around AI some very structured approach that take into considerations the early insights that we get, that we got from the early experiments, but also in a dynamicity, looking into the time and seeing what is happening inside of that and adapting our governance approach. It will not be one-shot solutions in all cases.
Thank you. And finally, Eduardo, so I was thinking more about low and middle income countries and how we can create capacities in those countries. If we can have a very, very short answer, because we have to go to the poll and then we have to end the session. So thank you, Eduardo.
Thank you, Ludovic. Well, I am a scientist, I'm a researcher, not an expert in AI. And my opinion is that the AI is very nice too. You can use it to solve a lot of problems found in scientific challenges, to solve the problems linked to policy or to make some solutions to health problems. I think that if you're using this kind of the tool, you need to firstly have a good scientific question to be answered, like all the scientific projects that we usually do. So the second point, I suppose that this kind of the tools, like the using natural processing language, as I show, have a lot of potential to be used in detection of the crisis or detection of emergency disease. So I suppose here in Brazil, we have a lot of the good scientists and good networks that could use such AA tools to solve health problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. So now we're having very quickly our polls. Colleagues, if you want to, if we can have the polls right now. Sure if I don't see the polls. Colleagues, if you can help us with the polls. Well, as we have a technical issue. Maybe Carla, you can start up. Here's the poll. So we have two questions, and we will appreciate if you answer the questions. You can answer them in different languages. So we'll give a few more seconds. And if you can show us the results of the poll. And I will ask you, each one of you, if you can in one sentence, comment on the results of what participants. Can you show us the results of the poll? Thanks. Well, it's taking longer than expected. But in the meantime, we receive many questions. So I have received many questions through the chat, through different mechanisms. Very interesting questions. We'll ask the panelists if they can directly answer those questions, because some of them are addressed to specific persons. Yeah, I think that this is a session that maybe we should think to have a longer session and a formal discussion around this topic, because it's a really important topic. So I'll ask if you can very quickly comment on the results of the poll. Julian, if you want to go first in 10 seconds.
I just think it's exactly as I would expect, that of course these are new technologies, and so of course most people are not familiar.
Thank you, Julian. Dr. Menhi or Eduardo, if you have any other comment.
I think that the fact that the people is not familiar or somewhat familiar is a large part of the rest of the poll show to need to show the use of this AI tools and the limitations of these tools and the power of these tools to doing research. So is very new, and you have I need some time to spread the use.
Dr. Mendy, final word.
Yeah, I think it's an exciting moment, because that's the first time that such a new technology is quickly brought to transdisciplinary area and gaining a lot of attention in other domains other than technical domains. So I'm not surprised, but I'm still surprised to see how people are interested in such new technology.
Yeah, my personal view is that there is a huge gap between us, health professionals, policymakers, researchers on health, and all these technologies, and I think that we have to create more capacities around this, make use of all these technologies. So with that, I'm going to ask Carla if she can provide some final comments to close the session. Thank you, Carla.
Thank you. Thank you, Ludovic. Thank you, colleagues. It's been
and all our colleagues and panelists. Thank you.
Thank you all. I have the challenge to wrap up our discussion and be sensitive to what has been the sentiments that have been expressed in the Q&A, which, as Ludovic said, are mostly about ethics. And I think that what I'll try to do in just few words is to connect one thing that Dr. Volp said initially, which is that we have to make normative aspects explicit. So she said we have to promote a discussion about the future we want. And some futures are better than others. A future with health, a future with well-being, a future without inequities is better than another. That others with disease and less well-being. So that we ought to do that is the main moral claim that I want to make. And I think that what you have shown in the panel with your experience is that the biggest challenge for unlocking the potential of artificial intelligence and for evidence-informed policy making is that we fail to grasp the actual evidence. That we know evidence saves lives, and but we face the challenge of using AI as a tool that advances evidence instead of compromising evidence. And I think there's a lot of worries about confidentiality and little issues of that nature, that someone's privacy will be stolen. But I would think as an ethicist that the main challenge we face at the intersection of evidence, artificial intelligence, and ethics is the challenge to use the technologies to advance health and well-being. And that presupposes that we find the ways, the how, not the what, but the how, the ways to ensure that accuracy is preserved, that we do the trade-offs between quality and currency properly, that we use the machine learning in a way that really that is rigorous, so it actually guides to better health outcomes for everyone. Thank you so much. It's been great. It's been a great session, and we're 5 minutes late, but I think that's not too bad, huh? Have a good day.
Thank you, Ludovic and Carla, for these very interesting sessions. And the 5 minutes late are still a bit better than the disappearance of 20 minutes of your moderator of the day. So to the entire audience and the entire group, and we have seen it in the chat and the questions and answers, I think we have had 2 very interesting sessions this afternoon. One on the question of strengthening the institutionalization and organization, and the other of a completely new field on which we should enhance the debate, continue the debate, which is also the basis of how is our knowledge evidence socially constructed and on what do we rely. So I think we have a future agenda. If we think about support tools, if we think about the timely deliverance of evidence and knowledge, we have a challenge in the agenda in which we need to continue the community building. So thank you very much for this great day. I hope that all the people, we've seen a lot of reactions in the chats and the question and answer sessions, that people have enjoyed it. But of course, at the end of the day and after these 2 sessions, it also raises the question on how WHO Geneva office would try to tackle and continue the reflection on these matters. So I really want to give the word on the WHO's unit head for evidence and policy and impact. And it's an important word. It's not only on policy, it's also on impact. Tanja Kuchenmüller to address some issues on this matter.
Thanks very much, Mark. Dear colleagues and friends, I'm delighted to take the floor for a second time during the summit. First of all, I would like to thank you all very much for your commitment and contributions to this event and for the lively exchanges. I really think that the fact that we had more than 4,000 people registered to the summit is a true testimony of the huge and increasing interest in evidence to policy that we're witnessing. Secondly, I'd like to take the opportunity to reflect briefly on the past 3 days and put forward a few ideas and next steps. And maybe I could have my slides up. Go ahead and to the next slide directly. So in general, building on the progress and lessons learned of implementing the EVIPNET call for action, we have seen on the first day that the strategic directions of the call are still very valid, and that the call needs to be reinforced, or metaphorically speaking, as you can see on this slide here, that the tree still needs to be nurtured and watered. This being said, there are 3 topical areas that I would now like to speak about more in detail, which were emphasized at the summit. Next slide. Further discussions shed light on and stress the need again for strong institutions that value evidence and that have capacity and routinized processes in place so that evidence is being used in all decisions. Institutionalization, as we had heard, is a systems change process that is very complex, multifaceted, multi-level and multi-actor oriented. So it requires time, commitment, and also resources. We have heard throughout the summit about a range of emerging approaches and insights for institutionalization processes. So, for example, Oman earlier today, Uganda and Brazil, they have provided many lessons for others to draw on. Overall, we can say, and we can see that an increasing number of different groups and organizations that work simultaneously, but also independently on producing institutionalization or promoting this area. And while the summit has provided an excellent platform for the sharing of perspectives and learnings, we do believe that it's time to formalize these processes now to more powerfully push the evidence to policy institutionalization agenda globally. Next slide. Secondly, the spotlight was put during the summit again on methodological pluralism and the incorporation of diverse types of evidence into decision-making processes. So it has been remarkable, I think, to see your wide interest and the emphasis that you put on strengthening the interface, on creating synergies between evidence ecosystem work streams and different forms of evidence that they're generating, but also on promoting citizens-backed evidence and related whole of society engagement processes to give citizens voice. And also, as we heard just earlier, the policy foresight, the future thinking, as well as the use of artificial intelligence and evidence to policy processes was very inspiring to see how cutting-edge technologies can significantly accelerate the provision of evidence to empower decision makers in the previous session we just had. Next slide. Thirdly, then, the discussions during the summit, for example, during the funders panel and other plenary discussions, such as yesterday's panel on working together and building collaborations and partnerships, these reminded us of the many interdependencies when strengthening evidence-informed policy and the critical role of collaboration among various organizations in the evidence ecosystem. It was stressed yesterday that only by working together, we can make evidence in decision-making a reality. So there is a growing recognition that global and transnational problems need also a global response, and building bridges across sectors and countries are required to increase the level of synergies and maximize resources. Overall, the summit has been an important stepping stone towards promoting exchanges of experiences and good practices. It was, I think, thrilling to see so many resources and examples from all over the world in the summit's interactive sessions on the Padlets yesterday. And this is a journey that we would like to, and in many ways should continue jointly exploring and advancing to build on each other's work and also expertise. So taking the three key topical areas that I've just mentioned in consideration, we believe that to advance the call for action, we need a global forum that works as a platform for discussion, convening and coordinating major global and regional evidence to policy activities, actors, and also organizations. And we therefore suggest to pick upon the 2021 Evidence to Policy Summit request and accelerate the establishment of the coalition of partners to overcome the persisting silo working and fragmentation of the evidence to policy landscape. Next slide. The coalition will allow us to build on the findings of the last 3 days and have the dedicated space to discuss and further advance the key topics debated during the summit, in particular funding of evidence to policy initiatives, institutionalization of evidence-informed policy, citizens' engagement, and also foresight. And initial steps towards the development of the coalition have already been taken. So deliberations on the function and form of the coalition took place at the end of February at an international expert meeting organized by our colleagues in the WHO Eastern Mediterranean region in Cairo. And also an informal coalition core group meeting was convened in June with a draft stakeholder map and also concept note, which has been developed. It's clear, of course, that such a coalition requires the mobilization of resources and sustainable commitment of partners across systems and sectors. which in itself is in many ways pre-assuming that the coalition is greater than the parts of its sum, meaning that it's generally going to add value on the one hand to the coalition members, and on the other hand to the vision of sustainably strengthening and institutionalizing evidence to policy. And then taking again into consideration what you said and listening to you, this would mean that the coalition's future role needs to cater for 3 guiding principles. If Elena, you can click next, please. So the 3 principles that we've heard from you is, on the one hand, that we need trusted relationships. As we have heard yesterday very clearly, evidence is not a substitute for humanity, and establishing partnerships is not only about facilitating structured engagement, but also building trust. Secondly, then, building trust requires humility and willingness to listen and learn and be patient. And thirdly, it requires transparency. So we need to be transparent about who is being engaged, for what purpose, and for which roles, for example, when setting up partnerships or deliberative processes. And we need to be agenda-free, meaning neutral and objective in our action to be credible. So with this, let me stop here. We will keep you and the evidence to policy community posted on next steps via our LinkedIn group. And many of you have indicated also in the summit registration form that you wanted to stay updated on any new activities and events we are on organizing. For our network members in particular, it is foreseen to take their needs, as was emerging during the summit, but also prior to the summit in a short survey that we undertook. We're going to organize regional multi-country meetings to allow for further elaborations on your needs and making sure also that we as WHO with our partners can cater for those. At this point, I would like to just very briefly, before handing back to Mark, thank all of you, the participants, panelists, and keynote speakers of the summit for your contributions and reflections over the last 3 days. I would also like to express a word of thanks to my colleagues and our partners who have organized the Evidence to Policy Summit, the EVIPNet country team members around the world, the members of the summit's executive committee, in particular the WHO regional offices, Cochrane and the Evidence Commission for their support and collaboration in organizing the citizens engagement session yesterday. My team and other colleagues in-house, such as the MRIT team and headquarters communications, the many volunteers associated with EVIPNet who have been tirelessly communicating about the summit, and of course, many thanks also to the great job of the interpreters. This is not the end of the summit, but I wanted to take the opportunity of this platform just to express my deep gratitude and thanks. And with that, I'm handing back over to Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya, also for introducing and making reflections. We are entering almost the end of these very interesting days, but at this part, we would like to invite a number of stakeholders to share their insights on what has been discussed, but in a very concise, specific way. We have a number of people having some introductions, and I would like to invite Catherine Spencer, the CEO of Cochrane Collaboration, to make some reflections.
Hi. Thanks, Mark, very much indeed. Yes, I have just wanted to really reiterate our commitment to the collaboration to E2P and the need to collaborate to ensure that we move forward. So on behalf of Cochrane and our global community of 117,000 members and supporters, I'm really pleased to reaffirm our commitment to the objectives of the Evidence-Informed Policy Network and the World Health Organization Global Evidence to Policy E2P Summit 2023. As you may know, Cochrane's mission is to provide relevant and timely synthesized evidence while advocating globally for evidence-informed health and care. And together with our partners, we remain steadfast in our commitment to mobilize our community to create a culture and sustainable program of activities that puts healthcare consumers, patients, caregivers, and the public at the heart of our vision. And we're committed to engaging with healthcare consumers and their advocates, to enhancing their understanding and use of healthcare evidence, and the involvement of consumers in the creation and dissemination of Cochrane evidence. And we really eagerly look forward to collaborating with the WHO and our partners to embed evidence as an integral component of global health decision-making. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you also for your commitment and engagement to develop this community. I want to give the floor to Shelly-Ann Hunter, which is the coordinator of Latin American and the Caribbean Evidence Hub. Shelly-Ann?
Hi, good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. The Latin American and Caribbean Evidence Hub recognizes that the Global Evidence to Policy Summits are very critical in galvanizing a global movement towards the institutionalization of evidence-informed decision-making. Assessments led by our hub indicated that countries in the LAC region have shown great interest in improving capacities for the routine use of evidence and have taken steps towards empowering leaders, building collaborations, as well as setting norms and standards. However, we recognize that we are not where we would like to be. We have identified challenges in building commitment from national and regional leaders, in agreeing on shared understanding of concepts and methods, in sustaining capacity development, and in securing and ring-fencing funding towards sustainability. Since 2022, the Evidence Hub has been promoting transnational and interdisciplinary collaboration, having conducted our first priority assessment with stakeholders during our regional meeting in Lassie. We are therefore well positioned to contribute to a coalition of partners for sustainable evidence to policy systems. Our involvement will enable Latin American and Caribbean countries to support and simultaneously learn from partners as we increase our capacity to facilitate the uptake of evidence to address equity in health, developmental challenges, and ultimately achieve our SDG targets. As the Latin American and Caribbean Evidence Hub, we are fully committed and are looking forward to a strong collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to give the floor to Isiaka Sombie, which is the Senior Research Officer of the West African Health Organization.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, there is some background noise, but yeah, okay, it's clear now. Good.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
It's clear. Okay,
yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon to all of participants. Our experience in West African region through the Canadian initiative, understanding and also capacity for stakeholders to have an enabling environment for support evidence informed policy. Achieving this favorable environment also requires multi-sectorial partnership, collaboration, commitment from decision makers, institutional framework, and also text to encourage constructive exchange between various stakeholders. As a regional institution, we are available, commit to support the key outcome of this meeting and work with all the partners to support institutionalization of evidence-informed policy process in our region. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this commitment again. I'm continuing to do the round of a number of stakeholders. I want to give the floor to Yodi Mahendrada, the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine and Public Health and Nursing of the Gajah Mada University, and is also the coordinator of the Southeast Asia Regional Training Center for Health Research. Yodi?
Thank you, Mark. I think my camera is not being turned on by the host. Okay. Anyway, so speaking on behalf of the Faculty of Medicine, Public Health and Nursing, Universitas Gajah Mada, we look forward to working with the coalition of partners to strengthen and institutionalize evidence-informed policymaking. For decades, we've been working on generating and translating evidence into policy and practice in Indonesia and also more recently across Southeast Asia, since we've been designated as the Southeast Asia Regional Training Center for Health Research supported by TDR. We've experienced firsthand the systemic challenges of our domestic evidence infrastructures particularly given the highly decentralized nature of our health system. During the recent pandemic, we've additionally experienced the challenge of translating evidence into policy within the context of high complexity and uncertainty. Now, throughout this journey, we've encountered so many institutions, initiatives, and approaches across the evidence ecosystem globally. These are often uncoordinated and disjointed, which leads to suboptimal impact at the country level. Therefore, we welcome the idea of a coalition that convenes leading evidence producers and intermediaries to unleash collective capacity, realize synergies, and catalyze actions towards strengthening and institutionalizing evidence-informed policymaking. So we reaffirm our commitment to the call for action, and we encourage stakeholders of the evidence ecosystem to support the coalition of partners to advance the institutionalization of evidence-informed policymaking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jordi. Thank you for this commitment. Next, I want to give the floor to Gerjan Ikink, which is the Principal Expert Public Health Foresight and Determinants of the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, ECDC, better known. Gerjan.
Thank you. I think also my camera has been turned off, but in policymaking, as well as in the provision of evidence and scientific advice to policymakers, strategic foresight is becoming an increasingly essential tool. It contributes to a more holistic approach, avoiding blind spots, ensure that what is delivered is more future-proof, and it can help overcome decision paralysis on issues with high uncertainty and complexity. So for ECDC, establishing and implementing foresight for public health is therefore a strategic priority. And in the last 2 years, we've been laying the foundations for this, and now we are really starting to integrate strategic foresight into our processes and collaborations. Now, of course, the major future changes we are facing, as well as their underlying drivers, are very similar to those of our partners. So it makes little sense to go at this alone or in a fragmented way. And that's why we definitely agree that strengthening collaborations with our partners, particularly also WHO, is very important. Let's coordinate our efforts towards our preferred futures with foresight together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerjan. Thank you. Next, I want to give the floor to Fadi El Jardali, which is the Director of the Knowledge to Policy Center and is also the WHO Collaborating Center for Evidence-Informed Policymaking in Lebanon. Fadi?
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Tanya. I'm really delighted that we are at this stage when it comes to the deliberation that we had in the last 3 days. I believe this second global summit really provided, I would say, a crucial catalyzing platform for knowledge exchange, capacity support, but also strengthening partnership. It clearly centers evidence as the catalyst for policy and societal change. I believe as we leave this summit today more energized and more committed towards an evidence-informed future, we look forward to carry the conversation, aspirations, and the lessons forward with you all. We will continue to engage in debate on emerging frameworks, tools, and building bridges across the evidence ecosystem and sectors, and create synergies and multi-sectoral collaboration and unleash our collective capacity. At this close of this summit, we at the Knowledge to Policy Center at the American University of Beirut remain committed to the WHO EVPNet call for action and to contribute to its agenda and future development. We also renew our commitment to the Coalition of Partners for Sustainable Evidence to Policy and Society Systems, which was launched at the culmination of the first Global Evidence to Policy Summit. As you might know, the K2P Center has been actively involved in the development of this coalition of partners with the EVPNet for strengthening and institutionalizing evidence-informed policymaking. Certainly, as Tanya already mentioned, this coalition will fill an important gap or niche when it comes to evidence to policy interface. It will harness past efforts made over the past few decades and build upon the rich history of already established organizations and networks, which we already heard about in this summit. The coalition will help promote unity, It will help unleash collective action across the evidence ecosystem and sectors, enable consolidation, optimization of resources and synergy, and catalyze efforts towards one broad joint approach for the institutionalization of evidence to policy. This is the time for all of us, I would say, to reinterpret our role and institutional strategies and determine the kind of structures, mechanisms, and arrangements that must be put in place to enhance evidence use and institutionalize evidence-informed decision-making across sectors and actors. Thank you.
Thank you, Fadi, for your inspiring messages. Next, I want to give the floor to Annette. Annette Boas, which is co-lead for the section of Transforming Evidence. She's Professor of Health and Social Care Policy at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Annette, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. There are many initiatives like the coalition we're talking about today, and they're supporting improvements in evidence use, but they're often operating in different areas, so environment, human services, health, in different countries and different contexts, like in the humanitarian context, rural communities, etc. But there are so many parallels and opportunities to learn from each other to support the evidence to policy work. And this is one of the things we're trying to do with the International Transforming Evidence Initiative, to provide a space for different communities to come together and have a space to share learning, sharing the very real challenges we face with this work, as well as the opportunities. Otherwise, there's a bit of a danger that we won't move forward and grasp the opportunity for change that is before us at the moment. I've heard so many interesting observations during this meeting, including the importance of humility to the work we're doing, of creativity, and also just how much of the work we do is relational and also drawing on many different types of evidence, so that methodological pluralism, and that's all great to hear. And for me, that means we're getting to a point with a growth in our capacity to produce and use research and a deep understanding of what we need to do to help get this work done. We talk in policy studies about windows of opportunity for evidence use, and many of us, evidence networks included, have been supporting evidence use in policy for many years now. However, I do believe that there's a real window of opportunity going forward, which the Global Commission on Evidence, for example, has done a great job in harnessing. And so as a community interested in the better use of research evidence, we are really well positioned to take advantage of the opportunity as we move forward. And with that in mind, Transforming Evidence really looks forward to working with the proposed coalition. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks a lot, Annette. Next, I want to give the floor to Siziwe Ngwabe, the director of the co-chair of Africa Evidence Network. Siziwe.
Thank you very much, Mark, for the opportunity to share. The Africa Evidence Network is a network of over 5,000 individuals from across the continent working to support evidence-informed decision-making to help tackle poverty and inequality. As we celebrate our 11th anniversary, we are committed to continued partnership with the WHO Global E2P Summit and the Call for Action and all its partners. And most importantly, I think despite the need for strong relationships and greater collaborations of often on a systems level, these are not prioritized. There is an underinvestment in an African evidence ecosystem in relationships and collaboration-based organizations and initiatives. Organizations like the AEN, the WHO, and VIPNet are explicitly focused on bringing people together through various modalities, media, forums, trying to build, to bridge the gap and strengthen the evidence ecosystem as a whole. This makes a unique contribution, trying to understand and deliver on what it means to be such an organization and how such organizations operate and function. And I think as the AEN, always we believe only together we can make evidence-informed policy making to become a reality. And I think it's most importantly as well, let's continue some of these discussions at Evidence 2023 in Entebbe, Uganda, and also online on the 13th to the 15th of September 2023. Thank you very much to be part of these amazing coalitions. The AEN is committed to this cause. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Siziwe. Next, I want to give the floor to John Levis, the co-lead of the Global Commission on Evidence. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark. And it's an honor to follow after CZ Wei, who I thought did such a fantastic job on day one of keeping those chief science advisors in line. Well done, CZ Wei. I think the last 3 days have really shown the value of learning from one another. And I've been learning from many of the speakers and from the comments in the chat box about how we can up our game in providing timely, demand-driven evidence support aligned to advisory and decision-making processes. I've been learning how we can enhance and leverage the global evidence architecture. And I've been hearing from our citizen partners about how we can do a better job of putting evidence at the center of everyday life. I'll just conclude by saying I'm really excited about the coalition of partners. I think that coalition working across sectors is incredibly well positioned to facilitate our efforts to learn from one another and really use evidence to achieve policy and practice impacts equitably at the country level. So thank you to the summit organizers, and back to you, Mark.
Thank you, John, for your concise and very precise message and commitment. Finally, I want to give the floor to Mugdarut Bangpang, the Associate Professor of Epicenter at UCL Social Research.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you all who involved in this summit. At the Epicenter, we has been producing research evidence for policy decision for 30 years. And at the beginning of our journey, we see that both researchers and policymakers had a lot to learn about how to apply scientific methods to address social problems that policymakers often face. One key to success we see is understanding how policy and research organizations develop their resources, systems, and culture to work together better. This outward-facing approach is what we all need to institutionalize. It means that we need to support researchers to understand decision-makers' ways of working, and at the same time, working with key decision makers to accumulate knowledge to inform their decisions, and together harness these key actors to find ways of working together across boundaries. We at the Epicenter, we support and confirm our commitment to the call for actions and to the global coalition of to strengthening and institutionalizing evidence-informed decision-making. In the coming months, the Epicenter will work with WHO to pilot the institutionalization checklist for routine use of evidence in different countries, and thanks to the generous funding from the Geneva Science Policy Interface at the University of Geneva. And finally, we are looking forward to working closely with all global partners, building on our work at the Epicenter in engaging with stakeholders, world citizens, and developing innovative methods to accumulate, synthesize, and use evidence. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all these contributions and of the different people, the different centers. I think we have it's kind of leadership to commit to this coalition, and I really have the feeling that at this stage with these messages we're already entering a kind of a soft launch of the coalition of partners. I think we can continue to work on that level, and that these 3 days have contributed to that. So, my dear participants, I thank you for being here, for following, for committing to the engagement, and we really hope that we can continue the work. Now, in order to, not as a real roundup, but maybe consider it as a start, I would like to invite Dr. Rana Hayek from the WHO Program Management, which is Director of the Regional Office for the Eastern Mediterranean, to deliver some key comments and reflections of what we have heard during the last days. Rana, the floor is yours.
Yes. Hello?
Yes, we hear you. Everything is fine, Rana.
Yes, okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon, colleagues. Just give me 1 second, please, because I'm having a bit of an issue with the network, but I will be with you in a second.
You were not the only one, Rana, today.
Yeah, it's okay. Yes, I'm actually on leave in Lebanon as well, but I think this is very, very critical and it's very important, I think, for me, and I apologize for not being able to attend more of this meeting. I was just looking at the agenda and talking with my colleagues, Arash and Mehnaz, and it sounds like it was an amazing interactive 3 days where a lot of learning and experience has been shared. And I have joined about at least half an hour ago, so I had the chance to listen to all the final comments. And to me, it's amazing to see the level of commitment from all the institutions, from the partners, because of course, building the capacity for evidence-based policy or evidence to policy is going to take everyone's effort to get to this goal. I mean, I think as an institution, I don't have to repeat like how committed we are as WHO to the whole process of evidence-informed policy decision-making. But I think, if anything, the COVID-19 pandemic, and I mean, almost every meeting I open or I close or I participate in, we have to bring the lessons of COVID-19, because I think 3 years of very hard won lessons that we need to capitalize on as we move forward with our various public health agendas. But what we learned during the COVID pandemic is the critical value of evidence-based policy. I don't think there's any policymaker or decision maker you will talk with now who does not fully understand why this is important. We sometimes struggled in the past to show the added value, because we work with member states. We want to make sure every single country has the capacity to do that, to do the evidence-based policies. But after COVID-19, where policymakers had to struggle with major decisions that basically not only affect the health of their people, but the health and the economy and the survival of whole societies, the whole idea of why we need strong evidence, I think, is now it has reached that maturity level that will allow us to better implement in countries. So I know that you have heard over the last 3 days from a variety of partners, a lot of shared experiences. You heard from our colleagues, from my colleagues also at EMRO, about what we are doing in the region in terms of the action plan. We had the resolution, we had the action plan, the usual WHO process, but we wanted to make sure we translate the resolution to a very concrete action plan so that we institutionalize that capacity. That's really, I think this is a very key word that I hope that all the partners will help us build that institutional capacity. We struggle with making sure that countries within governments, within ministries of health, have that capacity, because it cannot be only supported externally. So I think as partners, and that this coalition is going to be amazing for this purpose. Our main efforts really need to focus on how can we institutionalize the capacity for evidence-based decision in countries. The fact that we have the EVAPnet now in all the regions of WHO, I think it's great. We have great network of academic institutions, of various other partners, collaborating centers, etc., who are really bringing all their brains and their capacities together to help with that. We have the training. We've been doing a lot of training workshops to build capacity within governments. I mean, our focus is on ministries of health, but as we are seeing now from the need for multi-sectoral engagement, we need to build this beyond even ministries of health. But also what I really liked, and I saw on the agenda that you've had a lot of focus on the communities, the role of the civil society in terms of demanding from their policymakers to have better capacity of evidence-based policy. So I think, as you know, and I think you heard about, we have case studies. I really like we have about 15 case studies that we worked very closely with our with our countries, and they were supported by the network, evidence to policy network in the region from 13 countries to develop these 15 case studies. I'm sure you saw some of them, but I hope that by the next summit, we have every single country coming and presenting many of these case studies and publishing them and sharing information about how these experiences can inform evidence-based or evidence-informed policy making in all countries and in all regions. I mean, I'm not going to talk about all the the trainings that we did, the tools that were developed, whether it's the web-based training package or the the whole training we did to develop policy brief. But again, I think what's important is the sustainability of all these efforts, and that's why the institutionalization is very critical. We need to support countries in developing a good governance system to institutionalize evidence-based policy like we do. I mean, without governance and leadership and ownership from these governments, like anything we do when we are building health systems, none of these capacities will be sustainable for the long term, and they will help us getting through the next pandemic. God forbid, we know that there will be another one. I hope it will not be anytime soon, and by then we will continue to build that capacity in countries. There are many other examples where this capacity is needed. We are facing a major environmental crisis, which has been very evident the last few months with the floods, with the droughts, with the fires, the really terrible disasters that have had significant impact on health. But in our region, for example, one area where we are lacking this kind of evidence to policy making is the use of this capacity during emergencies. And our area is hit not only by natural emergencies, but as you know, by many wars, conflicts, others. And we need more. We need to generate more evidence to support better decisions during emergencies. But we also need to build capacity in the countries to also generate that evidence. So the road is not very easy to build it, but I think with this kind of commitment that was really demonstrated during the meeting, with all the great institutions, the great brain power and expertise we have, I am sure that we will be able to really support countries in building the capacity to generate the evidence themselves, and then to use that evidence in a very systematic way to make the right policies that will ensure that the health of their populations are adequately addressed. In our region, of course, we believe that we shouldn't leave anyone behind in the universal health coverage motto. And especially in serving the vulnerable, but we also believe that we cannot do it alone, and without partners, we're not going to be able to achieve that goal of health for all. So our motto in the region is health for all by all. And with that, I'd like to thank you really for hosting this amazing summit. And I hope by the next summit, we will see this capacity increasingly demonstrated in many countries all over the world, who will come again and share their concrete experiences together. Thank you again, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Rana. Thank you very much in your leave for these final comments, and especially these motivating comments and reflections. I think we're coming at the end of the session of a kind of a global community, which is really heartwarming, that we are creating a number of people explicitly saying that we need to develop and further develop this capacity building. I hope all the participants in the sessions, I think on behalf of WHO, but also all the partners, I hope that you have enjoyed the 3 days, that you have learned from things, that please share us your thoughts, your reflections, further comments in the chat. a number of reactions. There is a follow-up activity. This is not the end. This is actually part of a process of building further. So please stay tuned, stay connected. Have a look at the EVIPNet LinkedIn group in which you can follow a number of things. So for the future, please try to keep committed and empower the local, but also the global community on this level. Before really rounding up at the end, I want to address one particular thing, and that is the role of the team, and in particular the role of Tanya Kuchenmüller in preparing with the different teams, with the teams of the regional offices. But I think we cannot underestimate the importance of the WHO team with Tanya in preparing, connecting, communicating, and I would like to say a big thank you, Tanya, for helping to support these kind of developments. With this, I think we were at the stage of rounding up. Hope to see and hear you the next time with a little less technical problems. Have a very continuation of the day or the night or the afternoon. Thank you very much, all of you, and please keep connected with everyone. Goodbye.